Awesome. All right, we'll just give a couple minutes for everyone to join us and get settled in at their desks, on their couches, and their dining room tables. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la 5e session de la série Boîte à outils en sciences humaines numériques de la session d'hiver. Good morning and welcome to the 5th session of the winter 2021 iteration of the Data DH Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of digital humanities at the University of Ottawa, and I'm really excited to be hosting this series again this semester. Before we begin today, I'd like to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardienne traditionnelle de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent à Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people from this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I'm really excited to host today's workshop on teaching digital project analysis today. Increasingly, our research practices as humanists are digital. To teach the next generation of scholars is to equip them to use and understand existing digital projects and tools, while also girding them with the skills to analyze those not yet imagined projects. Today's workshop will offer strategies for helping students navigate and evaluate unfamiliar digital projects. Digital projects shape both what we can access and how we conceptualize our research questions. So today's workshop is geared to humanities researchers and teachers, and no digital experience or skills are necessary. Leading us today is our dear friend from St. Francis Xavier University, Dr. Laura Estel. Laura Estel is the daughter of the fifth house, holder of the sacred chalice of Reeks, and heir to the holy rings of Beta Z. She is also a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Digital Humanities and Associate Professor of English at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. Her research explores the reception history of drama by Shakespeare and his contemporaries from their initial circulation in print and manuscript to its online transmission today. Her monograph, Dramatic Extracts in 17th Century English Manuscripts, Watching, Reading, Changing Plays, and co-edited collections, Early Modern Studies After the Digital Turn and Early British Drama and Manuscript, model and reflect on how to conduct humanities research in the digital age. She is currently co-organizing the first DHSI East, a 4-day workshop on databases taught by Harvey Quammen that will take place in April in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. I'm truly honored to be hosting Dr. Estel today, and I'm delighted to pass the screen to her now.
Well, thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, Jada, pour ces chaleureux accueil. And thanks for welcoming here. I am speaking to you today from the campus of St. Francis Xavier University, which is in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I'm hoping that we can hear more about Indigenous digital humanities and our ways forward as we continue in all of our workshop series in Ottawa, in Antigonish. And I'm really honored to be able to come and speak to you from afar. Okay. Let's dive in, shall we? Just so everyone knows, I encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A function if you have questions, but because I have some slides, I'm not necessarily going to be able to see them, but Jada is going to help me and flag anything so that I will be able to respond. I'm happy to take questions throughout, and I'm also happy to answer questions afterwards. Despite what you may have heard, using digital resources is not the opposite of traditional humanities research. Even the most staid researchers use digital resources. In 2019, Ted Underwood noted, "It seems increasingly taken for granted that digital media and computational methods can play a role in the humanities." He concluded his brief reflection by saying, "Now it is just a matter of doing the work and teaching others how to do it." When I was an undergrad in the 17th century, no, um, I had a research assistantship for Professor Carol Davison at the University of Windsor, and she was working on a book on Gothic literatures. My job was to go to the basement of the Leddy Library and scroll through the microfilms to find copies of reviews of Gothic novels, like this one, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. And I was looking for these reviews in 18th and 19th century periodicals. Nowadays, this research assistantship would be wildly different. And I am mid-career at best. And so this is not that long that all of our research practices have changed. Now these reviews are available in digital collections. You wouldn't have to go to the basement of a library. And for many humanists, instead of learning to use microfilm facsimiles or a microfilm machine, our research practice involves finding digital facsimiles and using online platforms. And here's just some examples of digital facsimile of a periodical. Some you can see from Haughty Trust, the 19th Century Serials edition, and I'm not even pointing to all of those by Gale and ProQuest that are proprietary databases. Today, I'm going to draw on some of my work in progress about teaching, as well as my classroom experiences, to talk with you about how we can facilitate student learning through digital projects and talking about digital projects. I'm a literary scholar who turned to digital humanities because I could see it was changing the way we access and create knowledge about Shakespeare, early modern drama, book history, all my areas of passion. My examples are taken from English department classes, but some of the principles will hold true for other areas, even if it's not, of course, the exact same. I would like to thank my students for embarking on these explorations together. Any student who I name here, I have asked permission to cite and to discuss their work. There are a number, oh, hold on a second. The work today I'm talking about today is drawn from two forthcoming chapters in edited collections. One is Digital Pedagogy in Early Modern Studies, edited by Andy Silva and Scott Schofield. The second is The Digital Futures of Graduate Studies in the Humanities, edited by Anouk Lang, Gabriel Hankins, and Simon Appleford. I will be talking both about graduate classes and undergraduate classes, although now that I'm at St. FX in Nova Scotia, I am at an undergraduate focused institution. There are a number of ways to incorporate the digital, an often amorphous category, admittedly, into teaching literature at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Indeed, most Shakespeare classes include at least some digital components, such as research undertaken with early English books online, also called EBO, or the World Shakespeare Bibliography. Even if instructors plan an entirely analog course, students will turn to websites to complete the research with varying degrees of credibility. For instance, you might turn to ad-ridden SparkNotes. This is SparkNotes telling us how popular they are. 91% of, and this is a high school poll, but 91% of high school students use SparkNotes according to SparkNotes. So they could turn to ad-ridden SparkNotes. They could turn to the well-respected Internet Shakespeare editions. Instructors wanting to bring digital elements into the classroom can collaborate on assignments with existing projects. For instance, the Map of Early Modern London has a pedagogical partnership. You might have students write articles for Wikipedia. They might transcribe texts for EBO using Typewrite or Echo 18th Century Collections Online. Here, I'd like to make a side note that I actually have a Digital Humanities Quarterly article about writing Wikipedia articles on early modern plays. And if you're interested in learning more about writing for Wikipedia in the classroom, we have an upcoming talk that will be at the end of April in Antigonish I understand that you might not be in Antigonish in the end of April. If you are, you're welcome to attend. If not, we'll be putting this up on YouTube afterwards. It's Dr. Chelsea Webster who will be talking about women, websites, and Wikipedia, accessible digital pedagogy, and the undergraduate classroom. And she is a professor of ancient history, so I cannot wait to hear the examples that she uses. This is the keynote for the DHSI East event that Jada mentioned. There's a lot of great stuff out there about how to write for Wikipedia in the university classroom. So you could have students write for Wikipedia. You could join an existing pedagogical partnership. Large digital undertakings like Global Shakespeare's at MIT often include students as learning partners. Students could be encouraged to blog, and here I'm thinking about work by Peter Kerwin and others, or they could be encouraged to use social media creatively, as Kyle DiRoberto has argued. Tech-savvy instructors can even have students build a digital project in a class. However, today I am not focusing on equipping students as digital creators, but rather facilitating their understanding and use of digital resources. I contend that students need to learn to read digital projects and search interfaces. Reading interfaces and projects involves learning their scope, their boundaries, determining how they mediate and make the knowledge they present, and establishing how to use them ethically and efficiently. This is, of course, easier said than done. I am not, and I'm going to go forward to my next slide. This is a preview. You'll see what's coming up. I am not the first to argue that all humanities students need to learn digital research methods. Indeed, Christine L. Borgman maintains that graduate school is rather too late to learn how to use and evaluate digital cultural materials. So often when you incorporate a digital assignment or a digital humanities component into a traditional humanities class, the question becomes, but what do you cut to fit in the digital? I would prefer to ask the question, are we teaching current research practice if we exclude the digital? So today I'm not talking about a large final project that is digitally focused, although I will draw some examples from student final papers, very traditional in some ways, student final papers. I'm not talking about the creation of a digital project or having students join in on an existing digital project. Although if you are considering doing the latter, I would encourage you to look up Spencer Corralis's chapter in Disrupting Digital Humanities, where he talks about the importance of crediting student labor and how we can ethically undertake that, and also point you to the Student Collaborators Bill of Rights from UCLA, which was created by Miriam Posner and a team. I'm also not talking about digital humanities classes today, although these could potentially be useful there. I'm talking about literature classes, straight up humanities classes. What I'm offering are strategies that could be incorporated throughout a class. And I'll share one midterm assignment that I like to use, and I'm going to share another strategy for introducing a digital tool. Firstly, if you are teaching any research methods in a class, if you're teaching them in an undergrad class for students to undertake a final project or paper, you will obviously be teaching students where to find the materials they research. So today we'll talk about a mix of primary and secondary materials. Here is my beautiful Venn diagram that I just made in in PowerPoint of where we might be finding secondary materials for our research. My first piece of advice is collaborate with your librarian colleagues. They are great at coming into classes and talking about how to get secondary materials. This PowerPoint is actually more beautiful than what I usually do. When I teach in person, which I do not have the pleasure of doing this semester, I actually use whiteboard markers or chalk, and I scrawl circles on the board. And we start thinking about the places students can go to find articles about literature. So they can go to JSTOR, listed here. They can go to Project Muse. Some of the journals, depending on your library, you will have bought in packages and paid twice for and have access to from both JSTOR and Project Muse. There's also the directory of open access journals, which I have marked here as DOAJ. And of course, there's an overlap with that. We then talk about the MLA International Bibliography. And the thing about the MLA International Bibliography is if you are a literature student, it is going to have the materials on languages and literatures, hopefully, that you need. But it's not, of course, going to be comprehensive. And JSTOR and Muse are going to have things that are not indexed in MLA. So I like to start with my students and ask them questions. We do some comparative searching of these different sites, and we talk about what results we get in different bibliographies and different digital repositories. And the thing that's interesting is if you are actually undertaking any kind of somewhat interdisciplinary research, you're going to hit the end of MLA and you'll need to be going on to some of the other disciplines that get covered in JSTOR, Muse, and other places. The board gets really messy when I do this in class. We add EBSCO and ProQuest dissertations. In a graduate class, I'm going to go on and add the annual bibliography of English language and literature. What's interesting is that many bibliographies and databases give students the impression they have searched everything. Yet determining a database's limitations is pivotal to making sound claims about existing scholarly discourse and crafting arguments to be able to enter confidently into that discourse. An undergraduate might think, I searched JSTOR is an adequate research method. But as Lisa Gittleman points out, if students or scholars stop with JSTOR without seeking additional sources or pondering its contents and their limits, it becomes the system governing statements. Bibliographies are supposed to be extensive, but of course, not all bibliographies are going to have gaps. When I'm teaching this in a graduate class, and I've taught bibliography searching in a class devoted to graduate research methods, for the first class, the students actually undertake the comparison in advance. They compare two results, for instance, from Literature Criticism Online and Project Muse, and then they do the same search in a field-specific bibliography after reading an article by Graziano called Retrieval, Performance, and Indexing Differences in ABEL, that's the Annual Bibliography of English Language and Literature, and the MLAIB, the MLA International Bibliography. So that offers a model for the comparative queries that they do. In an undergraduate class, I just like to do a couple of searches with them in class and gesture to the broader stakes of this. I also assign in a graduate class Lisa Gittleman's article, Searching and Thinking About JSTOR, as well as the entries from James L. Harner's Literary Research Guide on Digital Archives, which in the LRG are JSTOR, Project Muse, and Ingenta Connect, and database vendors, including EBSCO, ProQuest, Gale, and others. Unfortunately, the MLA took the most recent digital site of the Literary Research Guide down, but they made the XML available, and Andrew Pilch from Texas A&M has put that up, and I will share the link for you if you want to. Double, unfortunately, is that the Literary Research Guide is not, to my knowledge, being actively continued. And so after its, I believe, 8th or 9th and final edition, that became it. So it will not keep pace with the advances in the field. Harner, in the LRG, dryly notes that none of these vendors provide a remotely adequate explanation of the scope or editorial procedures governing the databases they purvey. As he explains, serial bibliographies, indexes, abstracts, print and electronic that are published or updated at regular intervals are important resources, since they guide researchers to the most recent scholarship. Harner criticizes the unfounded assumption that the presence of such electronic bibliographies, such as electronic, and I love this turn of phrase he uses, bibliographical behemoths, as WorldCat or MLAIB and internet search engines have rendered more specialized bibliographies obsolete. As we add circles to this Venn diagram, it becomes clear to the students that no search is all encompassing. In a Shakespeare class, I'm always proud and happy to add the World Shakespeare Bibliography circle to this, which is lots of it is in the MLAIB and lots of it isn't. I'm a former editor of that project. For the undergraduate class, The other benefit of this class is that we use trial and error to think about what search terms are the most practical. We determine the different results from the databases, and after some painstaking trial and error, I finally turned the students over to the World Shakespeare Bibliography's About page. WSB, the World Shakespeare Bibliography, is a subscription resource. If your library doesn't have access, you can still access the About page on the web. And that offers a detailed description of the scope and how to use search terms. In this case, it can be a student's first introduction to Boolean searching, which can be eye-opening to students raised with a blank Google search bar. We discuss the difference between bibliographies and databases, their functionality and use, and we talk about how to determine the scope of a website and why the scope is important in assessing a project. What is in, what is out, and what is at the center and what is at the margin. Ideally, students will have some background in rhetorical analysis from introductory courses or earlier in the term, but this offers a valuable importance to refresh the foundational and important concepts such as what is a project's audience? How can we determine a site's credibility? So when I point out to my students that every bibliography has gaps, what we come to realize quickly is that it is often non-English voices from disparate geographic regions that are silenced. Although I usually budget one class session for this how to research workshop, sometimes it can spill over into later class sessions, especially if it's only a 50-minute session. And what I find it helpful to remind myself is that these ideas are such old hat to most seasoned scholars, but they're going to be totally new to undergrad. And so we really do need to give them the benefit of being able to explore these ideas in depth. Learning to question what is privileged and what is marginalized, indeed, what is present and what is absent in our searches, leads nicely to a critical analysis of digital humanities projects, with a focus on what they cover and how they present information. Because I teach in a literature department, I emphasize that assessing digital projects is a form of critical reading. Janine Solberg, for the study of history, asserts that digital tools and structures that increasingly support our research efforts have material and epistemological implications for how we discover, access, and make sense of the past. Indeed, digital projects need to be considered as arguments. They argue for the importance of the material they present. They shape the way users conceptualize and research texts and archives. That last part is also a quote from Solberg. Digital projects do not just present data, and I'm sure you've heard the old saw, no data speaks for itself. They offer ways of knowing and understanding the data they present. Although it is sometimes heralded as a brave new world, digital Shakespeare studies is not a new field. The landscape of digital Shakespeare studies, however, is always changing. New digital projects appear, existing websites vanish, and even those resources that have stood the test of time are updated with new materials and functionalities. So what I'm going to dive into now is an assignment I like to run in my classes. I'm going to focus on using it in a Shakespeare class, but it's also been very useful in early modern drama and book history courses, of course, with different subject material. And you could work it into even a more themed Shakespeare class, like one on tragedy or performance. This is a midterm assignment about digital project analysis. And this is a screenshot from my assignment guidelines where I offer my students some of the projects they could analyze. You can see this is cut off. This is not even all of them. And I update this list. I tweak it depending on if my class has a specific theme. If I were working on a Shakespeare in print class, I would have a different focus. If I am teaching graduate students, I sometimes put other sites on that I don't for undergrads. If students are writing traditional papers or taking exams at the end of class, this assignment shows them the range of approaches to Shakespeare studies and can prompt them to undertake original research It can also help with understanding Shakespeare's texts and contexts. Even students who are not interested in pursuing the field of Shakespeare studies will find the study of digital resources valuable because evaluating and analyzing online projects is an eminently transferable skill. By teaching students to critically engage with online resources, this digital project analysis assignment offers an ideal midterm assignment that can create scaffolding for final papers and other final projects. This also helps students think about, depending on the kind of class you're teaching, it can be really useful to think about different critical theories we apply and which critical theories are being used in their by these digital projects, which are being emphasized. The basics of this assignment are staggeringly simple. Each student in the class researches one existing website and shares their findings with the rest of class. Having students teach each other has multiple benefits. They gain mastery over one digital project. They actually talk about it as my project sometimes, even though it's just the one they've presented on. The benefits of learning by teaching, or LDL, lernen durch Lehren. Pardon me, I'm butchering that pronunciation. So the benefits of learning by teaching for subject mastery and communication skills have been touted for centuries and more recently lauded as a preparation for life in information and knowledge societies. In my experience, students often work harder when they know they're going to be presenting their work than when they think they're just going to be giving it to me. They want to impress their peers if they don't necessarily want to impress their professor. And rather than listen to me drone on about digital sites and how to use them, they hear firsthand from other students what the benefits or drawbacks might be of a particular site for their research. Because digital projects emerge, change, and sadly disappear more quickly than printed books, it can be difficult to determine where to even begin choosing projects. Thankfully, there are existing lists that I draw on. So this is the slide I have up right now is just the first part of the list I give them to choose from. But I did not come up with this list by myself. I'm going to come back to that slide. So for instance, the top one here is a page from Claire Bourne's of Pilcrow's website, where she has a curated list, different parts on performance studies, some on early modern theater history. Sarah Werner has a site called Winken de Werda, and on her site, she has an entire list of digitized first folios. There are other bibliographies that I have found useful in my research, including those by Adam G. Hooks and Cyrus Mulready. In your field, I'm sure you already know a number of resources that could be studied, and you already will have other lists to turn to. So you don't have to come up with this list from scratch. The number of valuable sites out there encouraged me to set up a meta bibliography of lists. So about early modern drama and book history. It's a list of websites. It's a website that lists other websites. You could also do an advanced search of the World Shakespeare Bibliography. And here I've just sorted it by document type, digital project. And you can see there's 220 digital projects listed. The top one, 154 revisited. I've never been there before, but I'm going to imagine it's about the sonnets. This is really interesting because I can see what's coming up, what's new in the field. But the thing that's important to know about the World Shakespeare Bibliography is that it includes things only when they are centered primarily on Shakespeare. So that's 220 digital projects centered primarily on Shakespeare. But for instance, the works of Richard Brome Online, which is another digital project, would not be included here. So again, you've got to do that pre-step to figure out what's in and what's out. The digital projects that you assign could be tailored to a particular theme, and I'm saying even a theme more specific than Shakespeare, like textual studies and text analysis, global Shakespeare. There are also existing lists that are printed, published lists in books, such as Hugh McCrae-Richmond's chapter on teaching the history plays using digital resources. The Arden Early Modern Drama Guides offers critical reader volumes that likewise have targeted suggestions for individual plays, such as Gillian Wood's and Laura Seymour's chapter on learning and teaching resources for Henry V. This assignment could be fruitfully undertaken by having each student compare 2 or more sites with overlapping content, or by having the presentations arranged in smaller groups. For instance, digital editions, print facsimiles. What are our differences here? Why would I want to go to the Internet Shakespeare editions and MIT's Global Shakespeare site to learn more about King Lear? Who are these resources designed for, and what makes them effective or not? The main difference when I do this assignment in an undergraduate class and a graduate class is the kind of digital resources I offer for the students to consider and the sophistication I expect from their analysis. Also, how much leading I'm willing to offer. Shakespeare's canonicity has led to the development of many important digital projects focused on Shakespeare. But there's a value in moving beyond Shakespeare, even in a Shakespeare class. This reminds me of the Jane Austen class that I took, where we also read a Mariah Edgeworth novel, because how can you understand what Jane Austen is unless you also understand what she is not? Moving beyond Shakespeare can help us put his works in context. If you're teaching a class on something less canonical than Shakespeare, and chances are it's going to be less canonical than Shakespeare, this can help students explore a range of resources. For instance, when I teach this class with my non-Shakespearean Renaissance drama class, it helps students see Shakespeare's works in the larger field of when he was writing and when he was publishing and when his plays were being performed. This assignment could actually be entirely focused on resources that are not directly on your course topic, but that are at the fringes of it. When I usually put on my list things like the Folger Library's A Digital Anthology of Early Modern Drama. I like to do a mix of some Shakespeare-centric and more general options. Students can get quite excited about their projects, like the Lost Plays database, which among its hundreds of descriptions of lost plays, I mean, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a database that gives any known information about plays where we don't have the text, plays that have been mentioned once, famously, for instance, Shakespeare's Cardenio, which we don't have, although is presumably adapted from Don Quixote. The Lost Plays database has 9 entries on Shakespearean plays and apocrypha. But the most important thing about this site is that it shows students just how much evidence we are missing, and it helps us better qualify our claims. Gia Alexander, a graduate student who focuses on book history and Victorian studies, astutely observed in her presentation, the Lost Plays database effectively argues that scholars' knowledge of early modern drama remains limited, with much content yet to be discovered. By extension, this website also argues that the early modern drama canon needs to be expanded, so it provides early modernists as a community of scholarly practice, a well-articulated, computer-supported collaborative workspace in which to share and build upon that work. In the last part, she's talking about how this site is a wiki that experts maintain. This assignment can also lead students to question why so many digital projects have a focus on Shakespeare and only Shakespeare. And it can be an effective way to introduce contextual materials into a single author or single topic course. I have another piece called Digital Humanities Shakespeare Problem in the journal Humanities, which is on that exact topic. Why are we starting and ending with Shakespeare? At the undergraduate level, I like to include resources that are specifically aimed for high school students or high school teachers. So for instance, the Royal Shakespeare Company's Shakespeare Learning Zone is of interest to students considering continuing as primary or secondary teachers. This past year, my students presented on, I had one student present on the Shakespeare Learning Zone. I had another student present on Australia's Shakespeare Reloaded. And both of these are toolkits for teachers and also have sections for students to come and learn more about plays if they're being assigned to them. And in the class discussion time, they talked about how these sites were different and complementary and why you might turn to one rather than the other. At the graduate level, students work with databases designed to facilitate more advanced research, such as the database of early English playbooks created by Alan B. Farmer and Zach Lesser, or the Patrons and Performances website at the Records of Early English, the Records of Early English Drama. There's also the Early Modern London Theatres from the Records of Early English Drama. One memorable semester, Reed launched their new website the week one of my students presented on it. She handled the situation with aplomb and helped lead the class in a discussion of how the site had changed, what had been improved, and why. I was just blown away with how impressed I was by setting students loose to do their own evaluations here. The myth of the digital native, a generation of learners who innately understand computers, has been thoroughly debunked. Students need to learn to use digital projects to make thoughtful arguments. So when we think about scope, one of the questions we might ask is, and this is an example I would use in a class, here's the database of early English playbooks. If we searched the launching of the Mary, an early English play, it's not included in Deep. Why? It's a play from 1632. This, as you can see from the description here, covers the beginning of printing through 1660. Where is the launching of the Mary? It's not a translation. Students learn about how early plays were written, published, and circulated when they discover that the launching of the Mary is a manuscript play, and that a database of play books, printed plays, is not the same as a database of plays that were performed or written. Why, when you search for Macbeth in early English books online, is the earliest search result from 1673. Shakespeare died well before 1673. Macbeth was published before 1673. To a seasoned Shakespearean, it might be obvious that Macbeth was first published in the 1623 First Folio, whose title, Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, omits the name of the Scottish play. But for students, to have an example of searching for the title Macbeth and realizing that the results are not what they expect, it can help them figure out how to reframe a question or when they need to turn to someone for help. These are the kinds of questions I'm happy to answer by email or my office hours. It's an opportunity for learning when they hear about the 1673 Macbeth, about the folio, like the first folio, all the folios, about anthologization, and about the 1673 William Davenant restoration adaptation, and so on. Furthermore, grappling with unexpected search results helps students discover the best practices for searching digital sites and for determining their scope. As Ian Gadd has pointed out, and this was way back in 2009, searching EBO can seem like searching all of early modern literature, but it is patently not the case. Each digital site is bound by its editorial decisions and practices. Something we might cover in class would be an example like, why are English short title catalog search results different from EBO and deep search results? And how do these projects diverge and overlap? What material is covered in JSTOR's Understanding Shakespeare series? It's Understanding Series Shakespeare Collection. It used to just be called Understanding Shakespeare. And what is the most useful or powerful way to navigate its results? I had a student presenting on that this term talk about, it's fantastic. So for those of you who don't know the project, Understanding Shakespeare offers a text of the play taken from the Folger Shakespeare editions, and then links to lines in JSTOR that quote that line from a Shakespeare play. And there's sort of a heat map so you can see which lines are most quoted. So if you want to guess, to be or not to be gets quoted a lot. But as my student pointed out, it turns out that to be or not to be or lines like that are not quoted in articles about Shakespeare. They're often being given as examples or as subject headings in other articles. Knowing what kinds of questions we can ask each project, this is the other thing about Understanding Shakespeare, that's the key, is that it ends at the circle of JSTOR because it's a JSTOR project. So it doesn't include, for instance, articles that are in respected peer-reviewed journals that only appear in Project Muse or only appear in the directory of open access journals. I also find this project useful for me because when I hear students present, it teaches me about the assumptions that I make. Interfaces that seem totally reasonable to me, like the database of early English playbooks, will be found dated by students. And it helps me understand where they're at and what assumptions they're making. By learning to use digital Shakespeare sites, students can create impressive and original research. One of my undergraduate students, Madeline Lowry, was fascinated by images of Victorian and Edwardian Shakespeare actors presented on Shakespeare and the Players from Emory University. This resource is a digital archive of images of postcards of actors who performed Shakespeare at the turn of the 20th century from 1880 to 1914. In her final paper, Lowry took this digital resource and talked about how Desdemona was portrayed in these early performances captured on postcards. She argued that in some productions of Othello, Desdemona was presented as a new woman, a turn of the century feminist aesthetic that reflected a new way of thinking about women's roles in societies and what women could and should do. For instance, bike riding. Lowry focused on a 1907 production staged in Manchester, featuring Margaret Halston as Desdemona and Matheson Lang as Othello. And here, the middle image is from that production of Othello. I have another image of the same time period where we have another new woman look. And from Lowry's paper, I learned about the Gibson girl, which is the image here, which is sort of the archetype that these new feminist women were aiming to achieve. I had never heard of it. And because Lowry was able to undertake original research, I got to learn as well. Students are not just regurgitating information that I give them. Students are going out there and working out their own thoughts on the kinds of resources that, would be that are used by scholars now. By making archival resources easily available for study. So, yes, these postcards have been around for a century, but they've been hard to access. Shakespeare and the Players allowed an undergraduate student to come up with an entirely original argument about what is one of Shakespeare's most popular plays. Rooted in the visual rhetoric of these ephemeral artifacts, Lowry's research would not have been possible without this digital resource. I would not have been able to send her to an archive to go in and find things, although those are wonderful assignments when you can get them. We don't all have the benefit of being near special collections that directly relate to our field. Archival research is often costly and time-consuming. We have to acknowledge that our undergraduate students are taking 5 courses, and so their final papers need to be appropriately pitched for their time. Also, I will add that it is harder to plagiarize when students are sent to digital projects because there's not as much out there. There are a lot of medium quality Shakespeare essays you can get for free or for purchase on the internet, but there's not a lot of them. I don't even know if there's any of them that use digital resources to make their argument. When you consider the vast amounts of scholarship on Othello, the fact that digital sites such as Shakespeare and the Players can facilitate new research by researchers at all levels is impressive. The arguments that stem from these projects, like Lowry's paper, are motivated by the implicit arguments the project makes. In this case, a site that suggests the value of images and historical productions of Shakespeare, and how a visual analysis of early photographs will help change our interpretation of the play's reception history. Even when students do a midterm assignment on a project and they choose not to use the same digital project for their final paper, because I don't actually make them do that, the skills gained help them better understand the works. Creating thoughtful evaluations is a vital skill in the humanities. Learning to assess a project's audience, credibility, usability, and scope is an important part of critical thinking. So, the other thing that's fascinating about these classes is that it models for students how we undertake our research. We turn to primary sources like those in the Folger Library's Shakespeare Documented. We count words and compare texts like in open source Shakespeare's Concordance or Shakespeare's Words site by the Crystals. We look at performance, translation, and reception history, often in national contexts, like Shakespeare en España or the Taiwan Shakespeare database. And that's just to name a few approaches. In preparing their evaluating digital resource presentations, students gain a depth of understanding about a given area. Listening to their classmates present give them a breadth of coverage that can otherwise be challenging to achieve. There's no single approach to digital Shakespeare studies, just like there's no single approach to Shakespeare's life and works. Even a full semester course on digital Shakespeare would be hard pressed to cover the range of academic Shakespeare sites, let alone the vast array of Shakespeareana on the web. But what I find is that this assignment builds on the contagious student enthusiasm, and it's brought about by their exploration of the online resources. So now what I'm going to do is just show you what I put in the assignment, so in the assignment prompt, and tell you some of the ways that I do it in class. So when I actually do the assignment in class, depending on the size of the class or whether it's asynchronous, whether it's in person, we sometimes do it 1 or 2 class sessions, so it'll be an entire week of presentations, or sometimes we have students present at the start of a class for the entire term. It just depends on how much time you have. For larger class presentations, I like to do the presentations in groups. So the way I do that is that when I have a class of 60 students or 100 students, which I am fortunate not to have at St. FX, but which I had in my previous institution, I would have students, they would choose between 6 digital projects, and then they would be in groups, and everyone in group 1 would research project number 1, and then they would present to a group of, so with someone from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is a technique I learned from Madame de Puder, my high school geography teacher, and it is just as effective now. So her metaphor is that group 1 would be the forks, and group 2 would be the spoons, and group 3 is the plates, and they go and learn about their projects. And then when they come together, you put them out in their place settings so that there's a fork, a spoon, a plate, a knife. And obviously the numbers don't always work out. So sometimes a student will have 1 group 6 person presenting to 2 larger groups so that everyone can hear about all the sites. And in that case, I just have students cluster around in the lecture halls, and I walk around and listen to what they're presenting, and they have a handout that's the written component. Because I know presentations can be very daunting to some people, not everyone has an undergrad in drama like I do. I like to have the written component be worth a fair amount of this. And the other reason I include a written component in this assignment is that it means that students have a record that talks about the websites they look at. So sometimes the written component, I have them just do web pages on the course website. So you create a wiki in the course website, and students have a page, and you make a main page with a table of contents, and students edit, and they have those resources. In person, I have also done old school 1-page 2-sided handouts. I like to have an annotation part of this assignment so that we can create a bibliography at a glance. So when students are working on their final papers, they can say, wait a second, I remember that Sandeep was presenting on something and that site looked really interesting, but I don't know what it was called. What was that again? And they can go and they can look through and see, oh, it turns out I need to visit Shakespeare Documented. Here are the points that I ask them to cover in their presentations or in their handouts, or both. And we also talk about, for undergrads, I talk about the CRAP test. I'm not sure if you've heard about this from Sarah Blakesley. You can look it up. It's CRAAP, currency, relevance. And what it talks about is, and these are guidelines you can use for evaluating anything, print sources, websites, but will this be useful to you when you write a paper, is what I want them to talk about, and how it could help with writing papers. Here's some of the possibly relevant points that I include. And this talks about things like interface and graphics. And we also talk about how you would know about this site. If can you find it through the library catalog? I have students create an argument about their digital project. So it can be a traditional evaluation argument where you say, here are the criteria that make a good resource about Shakespeare in print, and here is how this site measures up. And here's my sample thesis that I give them. The Internet Shakespeare Edition argues that scholars want to be able to compare early printings of Shakespeare's work, consult facsimiles, and use both edited and annotated modern editions. The ISE's functionality offers exciting possibilities for researchers working on Shakespeare. Its scope reinforces Shakespeare's central place in the English literary canon. So I give them some ideas of how they can make arguments. And I also always incorporate a huge amount of discussion on this. So when I'm scheduling this, as you know, if you have a 7 to 9 minute presentation or a 5 to 7 minute presentation, it's going to be 10 minutes. You can't, it will never, presentations always go long. And what I love is that the discussion always goes long. And I tell students that they get grades, and I do give them grades for listening and asking questions during other people's presentations. I hold my comments and do not make any comments during the Q&A period, and I let my students interact with each other. Teaching this online, it was one of the most valuable online experiences because my students, instead of the one-to-one me talking at a screen that we're living right now, they really got to discuss amongst themselves and got to make connections, and it really brought the class together as a cohesive unit. And I find it to be one of the most pedagogically valuable class times, so I don't mind allotting a fair amount of class time for these presentations and the discussion that goes with them. And here's what I ask for in the handout: an annotation, a thesis, a link to the site, and if it's behind a paywall, instructions on how to access it, a screenshot, at least one screenshot. When I went to teaching online, I allowed students to do PowerPoint presentations, but I limited the number of slides they could use, so they included screenshots. And their pro tips for navigating the site. And that way, it offers a reference material, as this says, for their classmates to return to. Most recently, I actually added a note to students that they could go and look at Early Modern Digital Review, which is published with Renaissance and Reformation, Renaissance et Réforme. And that is, it publishes reviews of digital projects based on early modern studies. And I said, here's a place you can go and look at for examples of how they approach things and what is valuable. If you're interested in Early Modern Digital Review and want to learn more, let me know. And if you would like to pitch a review or have a project to be reviewed, please visit the website, which is, oh, it's not here, it's emdr.eatercommunity.org. So the nice thing is, at the end of this class, students have a record of existing sites they can use for their final papers. And it's exciting for me to see when a student uses a project that was not the project they presented on at the midterm, where they see someone else present and they say, that's the project I want to use. On that note, I want to offer a different but related strategy for using digital project analysis in class. And this is actually about bringing in a tool rather than a project. And what I did for the first time this year, I did a class workshop on how to use Voyant tools. So this will be familiar to some folks. It's a very well-known humanities, digital humanities resource. And it's created by Jeffrey Rockwell from the University of Alberta and the current Canadian Society for Digital Humanities president, and Stefan Sinclair from McGill. It's hosted on the Compute Canada website, and it is an out-of-the-box textual analysis tool. So what you can do is you can load in a text, or if you're teaching Shakespeare, there's a Shakespeare Corpus preloaded, and it will create these different little facets you can see here. So for instance, on the top left, you see where it says Cirrus, that's a word cloud. I mean, it's like a wordle of the most common words in this play. This play that I've given the screenshot from is The Tragedy of Miriam by Elizabeth Carey. When I teach this workshop, it offers us an example to think about how an expert asks questions about something versus how a non-expert might ask questions. So if you preload the Shakespeare Corpus, there's 37 plays. It includes a lot of plays Shakespeare collaborated on, like Henry VIII by Fletcher, and the Henry VI sixes. But it doesn't include Sir Thomas More, which is a collaboration where we know Shakespeare had a small hand. It doesn't include the poems, so that might be something that's important to your corpus. We also talk about things like which texts of the plays are uploaded. It's a hybrid of folio and quarto. If you go to the group of plays, that's because not all of Shakespeare's plays were published in the folio. The folio is also not always the authoritative text. And it allows me to give some general observations about the Shakespeare corpus and, of course, point to Shakespeare's centrality to the canon. Shakespeare and Jane Austen are the only two preloaded authors. We can also talk about stop words. So last term, I used this when I was teaching King Lear. And I did a discussion with them on epizeuxis in King Lear, which is the repetition of a word with no words in between. And there's some famous lines in King Lear, like never, 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 never. And of course, lines like nothing will come of nothing. Nothing? When we go to look at the stop words in Voyant, however, the word nothing is a stop word. Voyant says the word nothing is not important. And I argue that that the word nothing is incredibly important in understanding Lear's tragedy. So when I gave the class demo, I had the students running it on their computers as well. We did some exploration, and I used it as the basis for sort of a traditional text analysis. So in previous classes, we had talked about the importance of clothing. And so we started looking up words related to clothing. And when we came to Voyant, I said, okay, last time I walked you through passages in the play. This time, we're going to look up words related to eyes and sight, which are, of course, very important in King Lear. We have Gloucester being blinded on stage. We have who can see what, both physically and metaphorically throughout the play. And instead of me having all of my passages pre-marked in my anthology, I let Voyant lead us to the textual evidence, and then we went through the textual evidence and created our argument that way. What was exciting is that one of my students then decided to use Voyant for the final paper. So this was Alec Foran, who is here at St. FX, and he went and he searched keywords relating to the storm in King Lear. So he looked rain, storm, tempest, thunder, wind. And he talked about how this emphasizes the argument of the storm's importance in the middle of the play, specifically in Act 3. You'll notice that Voyant chunks things in 10 sections. Sort of works with a 5-act structure, but not perfectly. It's not designed specifically for drama. And this is where Foran's argument became more interesting. This is where he took a digital tool and could do something that we couldn't just have done in class. We didn't read The Tempest in class, but he used Voyant to analyze The Tempest, to think about the storm words in The Tempest and to see how they compare to the usage of storm words in Lear. So I'm going to go back a slide. You can see in King Lear, they all crescendo at the same point. And in The Tempest, that's not at all the case. And so he was trying to make an argument about how the storm, what I love that he was able to bring in another play, acknowledging that it's not one that he did a close reading of, but to say that this supports his close reading of King Lear. The website for Voyant is here, and the docs.voyant tools is actually the documentation and online workshops. And there is a guide that, if you wanted to look at Voyant, there's a very pretty guide to Voyant from NYU that focuses on Kurt Cobain. Okay, as this talk has outlined, there are a number of important websites to be used in the teaching and research of Shakespeare, but obviously of any of the humanities research we're doing. It's equally important that we are equipping our students to do the same. Thinking critically about search results, scholarly databases, and digital projects might sound like a simple proposition, but actually grappling with these ideas is in no way easy. And it also means that there are times in class where a student says to me, "Why is this search result not happening?" Or what is happening here? And I have to say, "I don't know. Let's find out." And we can talk about things like what happens when you load an old spelling corpus into Voyant, or things like the Macbeth in the title of the first folio. To identify omissions in a project's scope, a student would already need to be adept in a field of study. But thinking about how a project presents its material sometimes leads students into questions about metadata, whether or not they use that word, thinking about taxonomy, categorization. All too often, our digital projects reify problematic notions of race, gender, and canonicity. Neither classification systems, metadata, or quantitative data are neutral. Miriam Posner suggests that to truly interrogate race, gender, and other structures of power would be much more difficult and fascinating than anything we had previously imagined for the future of DH. In fact, it would require dismantling and rebuilding much of the organizing logic that underlies our work. Well, dismantling and rebuilding digital humanities is beyond the scope of any one course. Having students start to grasp those organizing logics of digital projects is possible, however challenging. And although the majority of my students will not continue in careers as humanities researchers, this kind of preparation can help them become better critical thinkers by encouraging them to ask well-framed questions of the digital resources and tools that they will encounter as they move beyond the classroom. Thank you. I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I'm going to turn off my slide sharing so I can see the questions too.
I feel like you deserve a standing ovation. That was so rich, and I don't even know where to start. I don't even have a question. My mind is just like you're saying all the things that I'm thinking about. I loved the Miriam Posner quote at the end, talking about how we have to, dismantle and rebuild. And to sort of broaden this out, I'd say so many things. How we work, how we conduct scholarship, how we teach, but also just like the world we live in. I really loved your Voyant example. It reminded me of one that I did. The first time I used Voyant in a classroom was right after the RNC and DNC in 2016. And so we brought in Michelle Obama's speech and we brought in Donald Trump's speech. And I had two groups on two different sides of the room, like using Voyant for the first time, thinking about what words were coming to the fore and what this meant. And one of the word that popped up as the most used in Michelle Obama's was the word just. And they're like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, think about the speech. She's talking about things that are just happening. He just did this. This was just said. And so, like, there's an incredible timeliness in a word that, unless we're talking about justice, might be a throwaway term. And so I think of the value and the power of that tool in a classroom. And you just gave us so many other examples of how these digital tools can really reshape our discourse, but reshape the classroom and make it a really lively space for important and critical conversations. So thank you so much for all of this. We don't have any questions in the chat, but Professor Crompton has been retweeting quotes the whole time we've been here.
I will also say that the other thing that I really love about this assignment selfishly is that I genuinely learn things, and I love having that opportunity to learn from my students, and not just about arguments that you can make about Shakespeare, but also sometimes they will point out a new functionality that's been added to a site that I didn't know about. And I'll say, oh, great, I got to get back over there and see what's going on. Because I mean, things are happening quickly now in scholarship. And so really, this is a great way of showing students how we keep abreast, right? We share knowledge. And on Twitter, like Professor Crompton has been doing.
Yes. And also I'd add to that, I guess maybe a little bit of humility and like having students understand that like it is hard to keep on top of these things. And even though this is your field, something might get updated and you might not know about it in time for a presentation. I think that's really important for students to realize um, how quickly this all moves is exactly it. Like, you're a Shakespearean scholar and you can't keep abreast with everything. Um, and then it empowers them to come to the classroom and say, I taught my prof something.
Yeah, and I have questions and I say, okay, well, I don't always have answers, but we can figure out how to get answers, right? And when they see that I'm going to turn to an about page and actually pay attention to stuff that they would usually gloss over, it's the same thing like when you read an introduction to a work, right? Students are sometimes going to skip that, and I say, don't skip the introduction. It's going to tell you the important things.
Yes, it is your map to everything that follows.
Exactly.
So we do have a question now. I love the focus on encouraging students to do original research. Could you say more about how you demystify what we do outside the classroom in our research lives?
So I like to do that in two ways. One is that when I introduce this assignment, I offer them examples of arguments that people make using digital resources. And oftentimes it's examples of arguments that I make using digital resources. So the example that I just talked about when I was teaching how to use Voyant with King Lear, I mentioned epizeuxis. That's a journal article in progress that I'm working on, and it's an argument about how this repetition of words with no words in between is capturing the unutterability of the tragedy in King Lear, right? Like that's a very literary rhetorical analysis, but I've gone and used digital text in order to make that argument. I can show you quantifiably that King Lear has more epizeuxis than any other Shakespeare play, and that tragedies have more epizeuxis than other genres. And I did not count every instance of epizeuxis in the Shakespeare corpus in order to do that. And so I give them an example of like an actual research project, and so that's one way of doing it. And the other way is to come in with genuine questions. So that, I mean, that one I can often, I give them slides that I've been working on where I've started to figure out my hypothesis and my answers, but not being afraid to explore a hypothesis that you don't know the answer to. So to say, you know what? Let's try this with a different play in Voyant and see what happens. Or let's change our focus here. And then to sometimes say like, okay, well, that was sort of a non-starter, but other times there will be those moments where something does take off and suddenly the students are asking questions and trying things and experimenting. So I find both of those work to help demystify research practice. And also, like, the nice thing is that if you're working on something, you're usually enthusiastic about it. And then students find that contagious too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say they must. I get this sometimes when a topic is maybe ordinarily not the most exciting, like bibliography can sometimes be boring from a student's perspective. But if you're excited about it, sometimes that is really infectious and contagious to a student. They might find themselves excited about something that is otherwise not something they would otherwise be having a party about.
Right. And I actually think bibliography is the perfect example because and the other thing about that, so I sort of did the segue here where I talked about secondary sources and bibliographic research before the analysis of digital projects. And that's often how I frame it in our class time as well. But because they see that they need to find secondary resources, and it's not just for your class, they're doing that for everyone else's classes too. But you know what? In not all their classes are they being taught how to find those secondary resources, and they can feel a little bit in the deep end. But also, like, I genuinely care about bibliography and how things are searchable and what's made searchable. And when you find instances of omissions in bibliographies, like, I love those light bulb moments.
Yeah, me too. I feel like we could have a whole workshop on this kind of pedagogical practice. It's something that I've always been interested in too. So I really appreciate another what do we call us, bibliophiles? I'm not quite sure.
The bibliophiles are just book lovers, which I mean, I also am, but not the same.
Yeah, we'll have to find a word for us, bibliography enjoyers. Well, if we don't have any other questions, maybe we will end it there. Thank you so much. This was such a thought provoking session. I'm really excited to sort of continue to break down a lot of these ideas myself, and I'm sure all of our guests are as well. Oh, we have a question. As a librarian, I'm very happy to see that you're teaching these types of research in your skills. Do you ever invite librarians into your classes?
Absolutely. And I did mention it, but it was early on in the talk that you should absolutely invite a librarian in to do some of this teaching for you, because they are going to bring up examples that are not the same examples that you would use. And then I actually had a librarian into my class on Monday, Lorinda Matheson from the St. FX Libraries, and it was fantastic, especially when we started talking about Boolean search operators, different examples. I recently saw a really good example on Twitter about why you would use a controlled vocabulary. And it's, if you're using the word Waldorf, are you talking about the school or the salad or the Muppet?
Yes.
And you could use Boolean operators to get there. Do I give grades for working with librarians? Okay, so if I was going to assign a project where students had to work with a librarian one-on-one, then I would consult with the librarians first, because I don't want to overcommit librarians without their permission. However, I have had assignments where students have gone into special collections, and that involves working with a special collections librarian. And so in that case, yes, they're working with a librarian one-on-one. In other cases where I have librarians come in, like in more general cases, I have librarians come in and do guest classes, and then also they're always so kind and welcoming and say, please bring us your questions. And then I can tell when the students haven't asked a librarian a question. I once had a student tell me that our library was out of literary anthologies. We weren't.
Just out of.
Yeah, there were none left.
I
Um,
love that.
yeah,
I love
which
that.
we weren't. And the assignment was any English literature anthology. That was the assignment.
Right.
Exactly.
That is too funny. I feel like personally the thing that I'd add to that too is like uh, you're not going to teach these students forever. You're not going to be their only instructor. And so once they leave your classroom, you want them to know the librarian so that they continue to build a relationship with them. So that's, even if it's just for a short session, I've always felt like you've got to come in because you have to see them. They have to see your face. They have to know who you are and how to contact you and where your office is.
And
Because,
sometimes it's nice to get the students into the library building, right? To
yes.
see where things are. Because once they've done that and they realize, okay, then that makes it a huge difference. And also ways to contact our librarians. Like I personally use the chat button on our library website to be like, excuse me, I can't figure out if this catalog link broken. And thank goodness for that, right? But maybe students aren't doing it and they need to know how they can be in touch, right?
Yeah. And I think shyness or intimidation often plays a big factor, especially if you're maybe at a bigger institution and you're one of 40 or 50,000 students. You might feel like, I don't want to bother them or I don't know where to start. And breaking down some of those barriers is really important. And to read this comment, sounds like a great way to help students who might be shy about reaching out. Great. And now they'll know some friendly librarians. I mean, librarians and the library are really the heart of our institution. They're, you know, we need them, and so drawing on the resources is so important.
And at the same time, we also have to be able to think about how the information we're accessing through our library is then still mediated. So it's not just your collection that is curated by your subject specialist librarians, but if you have a discovery layer on your library catalog, Matthew Reedsma has an article that I have my graduate students read. That's so in my chapter that I talked about grad research. One of the whole focuses is on grad research in the library, and there's biases in those. So, for instance, when you do a search on women in the workforce, they were coming up with responses that were entirely inappropriate, and they. I can't remember which discovery layer it was that then fixed that. Summon maybe. they fixed it because Reedsma wrote this article, right? Like, so again, like it's the same questions of how are we accessing that information, right? And that's why we need people. That's why we need librarians and not just catalogs.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm basically going to be emailing you for your bibliography from today because I've written down, many names.
Great, I got it.
Thank you so much for this. It's such a great, great panel. Um, I'm not sure if those who are in attendance today are aware, but we actually had added in a sixth workshop. So on April 7th, join us for what is called a very brief introduction to linked open data with links. We're welcoming Drs. Susan Brown and Kim Martin from Guelph University. Registration is open. On our dhsite.org website. And so we'll meet again in 2 weeks. So April 7th at 11:30 Eastern here on Zoom. And I'm really excited to end our semester with another set of guests from our Canadian DH community. And in the meantime, just have a wonderful couple of weeks. We'll see you April 7th.
Thank you.
Bye.